I appreciate the introduction, and certainly it is true that we are became and have remained real friends. And in fact, I have often said, I said it at the time, I could not have functioned as Metro, certainly as chairman, without Norm. Which leads me to amend one of the things that he said about cranes when I was first appointed to the board. There was a press corps that used to regularly attend all of the Metro board meetings. I don't know if they still do. There's not much of a transportation press corps left in Chicago anymore. And at my first meeting, after my first meeting, they all gathered around me. Some of them actually remembered, if they were old enough to remember me from my days in the city council, which was a very long time ago. And they said, "What are you doing here? Aren't you a bicycle commuter?" Which is true. I still am a bicycle commuter. This is a little far for me to ride up here from Lincoln Park today, but when I can, I ride my bicycle. And I said, "It's true. I don't know a damn thing about railroads." And they said, "Well, why are you here?" I said, "I am a professional question asker." And fortunately, that is the talent that got me through at the STB as well, since I continue to know very little about railroads. The railroads seem to think I do know something about them. What I know about them, they don't like. So I'm delighted to be here, and I was grateful for Norm's, I guess it's another one of my board members. So, God, there's three of us here who survived. So I subtitled the topic I was going to talk about my 5 years at the STB as did I or the railroads learn anything? And the answer is that I learned a great deal of humility about government's ability to intervene in the private business sector. And the railroads, or actually their shareholders, learned absolutely nothing. So let me elaborate. And I'm going to speak roughly today from bullet points rather than with any great precision as compared to when I gave speeches, and I gave many as chairman of the STB. I learned very quickly after my first speech that the Wall Street analysts, or I call them bloviators, paid very close attention to what I said, and often after one of my speeches, you could see changes in the market on various railroad stocks. Didn't last very long. It'd go up or go down for a day or two, but that caused me to be very touchy about it. So when I gave speeches, I had a whole staff of economists at the STB who were more than happy to make sure I didn't screw up the works, and so they would very carefully vet numbers and data and things that I put out, and I tried to be accurate. But nobody cares anymore what I have to say, and so I can be a little bit looser here. Let me first give you where I see, and I'm going to assume that people here today have a lot of familiarity with the rail industry and hopefully some familiarity with the STB. So I'm going to skip over with some general statements, but I hope we will have plenty of time for questions, and I hope you'll cover me with questions on anything that you'd like to get into in any more detail. Let me sort of give you my take, as not unique, on the current state of the railroads as it relates to the national economy. Fortunately, we have some fairly fresh analysis of that situation that was made public at last week's STB hearings. The STB had 2 days of hearings on the status of growth or lack thereof in the rail industry. And what we learned was there was nothing new to learn. Really not much has changed in recent years. Despite the service meltdown, the service crisis that sort of began during and then got very intense shortly after the let up in the pandemic in 21 and 22. Some of you may remember it got so bad that I convened 2 days of hearings. We very hard to say things as clearly as you'd like to, sometimes in the federal government, so the title of those hearings was urgent issues. But the urgent part got underscored, and then the hearings made it clear. And we went into great detail as to what was happening and with the railroads and why we had gotten into the service crisis. And then we required the railroads to do a great deal of additional reporting on a monthly basis on service issues, and particularly on employment, training, and retention of employees, which was at the heart of it. And there was a hope and a thought at the time in 22 and 23 that maybe railroads were beginning to get the message, but it was short-lived in my view. And while there has been a tiny increase in the number of car loads and an improvement in service from what had been a very, very low point during the pandemic, I don't see any fundamental change. But let's put this in a little bit, and I'll gloss over some general figures in the historical record. And fortunately, by the way, I'm going to give them credit even before I cite it. There were a number of really great witnesses at these hearings last week, and I knew them well because they had testified at hearings when I was chairman. And we all used to, you know, there's a circuit out there in the rail industry. I'm sure some of you have attended these. There's all of the Marses and Nearses and Searses, you know, I assume what I'm talking about. And I was invited to speak to most of them. And then there's Rail Trends in November in New York, which is sort of the Wall Street focus. And all the same speakers show up all the time, and we all said the same thing the whole time, 5 years that I was there. And nobody ever changed their behavior. So I tried to focus as much as I could. So I'm going to give credit for the initially here to presentation that Rick Patterson, one of the Wall Street, and I don't call him a bloviator because he is one of the few who actually gets right to the point, works at Loop Capital. And so these numbers are from his analysis, but it's all public data from the STB. From the year 2000 until the year 2023, 2000 is a good starting point because that's really when you had the results of all the post-Staggers consolidation down to 7 class ones. So beginning in 2000 until 2023, rail volumes have declined by 7%. During that same period of time, the national economy grew by 50%. Now, some of that economy is Apple phones, you know, and so there's not a lot of rail traffic, but the whole economy grew. Truck tonnage grew, which is a better measure, by 43%. Rail by 7%. If you just look at carloads in 2003, there were just under 26 million carloads. In 2023, there were just over 24 million, so about a 2 million decline. Yes, coal went down, but a lot of other freight went up, and it went up on truck. So, you know, it's not a wild statement to say that the freight rail industry has utterly failed to grow and increase the amount, with the increase in the amount of freight that we're moving around. This outsized reliance on trucks has really overtaxed the nation's highways, and of course, has been a huge contributor to greenhouse gases. So why focus on the last 20 years? Why is that so important? Most observers, depends on who's doing the estimating, but roughly, I think it's fair to say that most people estimate that the amount of freight that moves around this country between now and 2050 will grow by about 50%. So think about that. How are we going to move it? Where is it going to go? Oliver Wyman, which is, in my view, or at least the person who I've got to know there, to embarrass this, one of the premier consulting firms in the rail industry, estimates that if rail continues to fail to grow with the growth in freight, the federal government will have to invest $332 billion between now and 2050 in highways to move the additional freight. But, and Oberman didn't spell out in detail where that money was going to be spent, but let's just think about this for a minute. If you've been on I-80 across Illinois, if you've been on 94 between here and Detroit, which I travel because our daughter is a professor in Ann Arbor, we go up there frequently, or you take I-95 down towards Indianapolis, and those I-65 rather, these are the ones we immediately know, but you can all over the country. They are today clogged with semis. It's very hard to go 70 miles an hour on those highways if you're a car. We were just there last week, and it was just one line of trucks between here and Ann Arbor. So if we increase the amount of freight by 50%, and the railroads don't pick up their share of it, you're not only going to need to maintain the highways, and I think $332 billion over 25 years is probably not too far off. You've got to add more lanes. And where is this additional land going to come from? I mean, it's just not physically possible for the economy to grow on truck. It reminds me, Norm and John, of something that was drilled into my head in my early days at Metra. And I love this statistic so much that I cite it, even though it doesn't have to do with freight. You can translate it into freight as a general way. It was pointed out to me, so pre-pandemic, Metra used to carry 300,000 people a day in and out of the city. It was pointed out to me that if Metra didn't exist, you would need 29 more lanes of expressway to move that many people in and out of the city. So let's assume somebody said, well, we don't want rail anymore. You can't construct 29 lanes. I don't know that it will take 29 more lanes of interstate to move 50% more freight, but try to imagine 2 or 3 more lanes on some of these broad routes. It's just not possible, and it isn't going to happen. So if we don't do anything differently from what we're doing today, I think the economy is likely to grind to a halt. And the only place to pick up the slack is rail. And I was thinking about this, by the way, just yesterday with the news that the Mississippi is again at a low ebb. It's been at a low ebb for 3 years, and a lot less grain has moved through our economy as a result, and rail is simply not there to pick up the slack. It picks up a little bit, but there's just not enough rail to do it. You can't move it on highways, and so when we think about planning and how we're going to handle our economic growth in this country, we need to take into account that we have climate change and droughts, and the Mississippi is not reliable. It's great when it's there, but the highways are done, that greenhouse gases need to be curtailed. That leaves us one beautiful, brilliant option, which is rail. Unfortunately, the U.S. Department of Transportation has estimated that at the current operation of rail, the railroads will not only grow in their market share, but if nothing else happens, we'll have actually a 4% decrease between now and 2050 in the percentage of freight that they move. This is obviously frightening, and something that we all ought to be very concerned about. Now, it's not a mystery of why this is happening. Oliver Wyman did a survey 4 years ago of the logistics managers at virtually all of the major users of rail, major shippers of rail, the big folks. 100% of the logistics managers, so there's no margin of error in this poll, and 100% of the logistics managers said that truck was a superior experience for their companies to rail. even though they much prefer to use rail. There's all kinds of advantages to major shippers to move their stuff by rail, assuming the price is right and they can rely on it. I would urge you, if you're interested in this discussion, to go onto the STB website and get the Oliver Wyman presentation from the hearings last week. Much longer, and I don't want to take up time, but they're very, very thoughtful, and they give you a lot of great information that ought to be taken into account when thinking about transportation policy. You all also ought to take a look, by the way, at Rick Patterson's submission, and although he is very much a partisan, Rich Edelman, who is the top rail labor lawyer in Washington, also made a detailed presentation, and it will give you a lot of very hard data on current rail employment levels, which is a large part of the problem. In all the years that I attended all of these forums where all of these same people spoke, including the rail CEOs and or their chief operating officers, I never heard one word about railroads planning for long-term growth in the economy. They all, about 3 years ago, somebody came up with the phrase pivot to growth. And all of the railroads started saying, we're going to pivot to growth. But what you never heard, he said, what does that mean? So how many carloads next year are you going to have compared to this year? And how many carloads 10 years out from now? How many employees to move them? How much more infrastructure? Are you ever going to build a siding long enough for your 15,000-foot trains? They never talked about it. And we never heard about long-range planning, which is pretty depressing when you consider how long it takes to plan for railroad growth. We're talking about massive infrastructure measures that cost a lot of money, take a lot of engineering, a lot of planning, and I have to say, for good or bad, a lot of government review. You know, it took for a merger, and hopefully I don't anticipate any more class 1 mergers, it took over 2 years for the board to review the most recent merger. It could take almost that long to build a new spur. UP has been trying to build a spur out in Mesa, Arizona to serve a new industrial park, and they ran afoul of the Native American tribes there because they started scraping off a burial ground without permission. And that thing's been on hold for over 2 years. The industrial park is screaming for rail service. So long-range planning is needed. Instead, all you ever heard here from the railroads, all I ever heard and all I heard last week, what came to mind was what Richard J. Daley used to refer to as higher and higher platitudes. There are some exceptions, isolated, I would call them isolated exceptions, but important ones. So I don't want to just badmouth everybody in the rail industry. I think one of the most significant moves in recent years is the arrangement or deal or joint venture or whatever it's called between BNSF and J.B. Hunt. And it's really quite far reaching. I had a meeting with Katie Farmer just about a year ago, and the plan for that to work, and BN has pledged publicly, as has Hunt, that the result of this effort will allow BN to deliver the exact same on-time performance as trucks, which is over 95% on time. And I asked her, how are you going to accomplish this? You can't just say, we're going to get there. And she rattled off a large series of expenditures. From memory, I don't want to disturb her because I'm not going to get it all right. They are in the process of finishing double tracking the entire southern transcon, which is desperately needed. They're triple tracking parts of it over the mountains in California, because you really need triple tracking to get some of these long intermodal trains to go past the heavy, slow trains going up and down mountains. And they're finishing a line through Kansas, which will in effect give them a triple track through Kansas. There were a half a dozen yards along the way, and I don't remember them, where BN is investing in infrastructure for lifts and other equipment that's needed. Because the real key to getting that intermodal service up to speed is not so much how fast the train goes across the country, although that's important, but when it gets there, getting that container unloaded, find the right driver, the right chassis, get them out the door. And you need infrastructure and planning to do that. One of the things, by the way, that's interesting about this is that, and I thought it was really one of the most enlightening ways of approaching railroad management, in the dispatching center in Fort Worth. I don't know if any of you have ever been in one of the class 1 dispatching centers. They are, you know, it's like walking into the Pentagon, you know, rooms with thousands of monitors and dispatchers. In the dispatching room in Fort Worth, there is now a JB Hunt personnel sitting right next to the BN personnel, so they can jointly make dispatching decisions. So BN doesn't have to guess if that train is slow, which one is more important to JB Hunt's customers to move in its place and so forth. So that's part of the plan. Hopefully, Berkshire Hathaway will not stand in the way of spending all this money that's needed. And of course, the big ticket item is the Barstow intermodal facility, which is $1.5 billion investment, which will be key as a key part of it. So I don't hear this from any other class 1. Here's specific money, specific plan. They talked about 11 million units going from the highway to rail. There's only about 1 million units moving around now. So imagine the increase that will be to the rail system. That's an example. I don't want to spend any more detailed time on. We can talk about it. If you look at what Keith Creel is doing at CPKCS, he has been very ambitious, even before the KCS merger, with increasing their infrastructure and their ability to move traffic, particularly involving international traffic and ports. Those two people have been very creative, and they seem to have owners that are willing to support it. Although I will note that in the last year, the folks at Berkshire Hathaway seem to have cracked down a little bit on what the BN management's been able to do, and that's disappointing. But over the long haul, they have been better. So I think we all know, I don't want to dwell on it in length, I used to speak about it constantly, why there has been no growth in the last 20 years, and why, for the moment, we can't really expect to see any growth in the future meaningfully. Since the consolidation of the class 1s, they have effectively become monopolies for a very large portion of their shippers. Only a small portion of shippers who have real immediate access to 2 class 1s. And they behave, I got a earful of education over the time I was at the board from our really top flight economists. All I remember is that monopolists behave like monopolists. They raise prices and they cut output, and they're very happy to do it. And they don't want to increase output because that lowers prices. It's really not much of a mystery. And so they make more money in terms of distributable cash to their shareholders, and thereby raising their stock prices by doing what they've been doing. It's really not much of a mystery, and there's a tremendous pressure for them to continue that way, because it is a lot easier for monopolists to squeeze their existing customers and rake in the cash than it is to go out and find new customers. You know, one of the, and I'll mention briefly in a minute a little bit about rail employment. A lot of the focus has been on laying off engineers, conductors, carmen, and maintenance away and so forth. One of the things that I heard constantly, and I think it's still true, I think it was mentioned at the hearing last week, from shippers, is that they cannot get a salesman on the phone. They want to increase their output, new shipper comes along, you can't get a salesman to return your phone call. Well, what kind of business is that? I don't have an MBA, but I'm pretty sure selling your product is part of the reason you're in business, should be in business. So, it's not surprising that when they can get away with it, that is the way the railroads have been behaving. And I will not fail to mention what's happened at rail employment. You probably know this if you've heard me at all or read any of the stuff in the trade magazines. Basically, rail employment has decreased by just under a third over the last 10 to 15 years, about 45,000 fewer workers. And I used to say, this crowd will probably appreciate this more than Washington, where they didn't really understand Chicago politics. But I don't know any business operation that can cut a third of its workforce and not lose productivity, except for one. And that is garbage collection in the city of Chicago. When I was first elected to the city council, every city garbage truck crew had 4 men, and they were men, by the way, in those days. You do have some women now. We were the only city in the world with 4-man garbage truck crews. The driver, under his union contract, and I am very pro-labor, was not permitted to get out of the truck, so he just stayed in the truck. In those days, any of you who lived in Chicago would know that the ward committeeman delivered a 55-gallon drum to your backyard. Those were your garbage cans. Those suckers are heavy. So there were, and they didn't have the lifts. So there were 2 men who walked in the back, lifting the 55-gallon drums. And the 4th man's job was to walk in front of the truck. And be a precinct captain, primarily. So I used to say, you could cut 25% of the workforce, which finally happened under Harold Washington, by the way, and not lose any productivity. I don't know any other business that could do that, and certainly not the railroads. By cutting this many workers, by raising prices have gone up somewhere between 20 and 30% in the last. But, you know, the railroads like to say, you know, since Staggers, prices just went way down. And they did in the first 10 or 15 years after Staggers, until about 2003, when everything was consolidated. And since that time, they've gone up by 20 or 30%. The combined effect of these rail operations have allowed the railroads to pay just over $250 billion in buybacks and dividends in the last 12 years. Now, I was so astounded by this that every time I gave one of those speeches, I got the exact most recent numbers. But it's over $250 billion by now. And of course, stockholders have to get a return, but they don't have to get that much return. And a large portion of that $250 billion could and should have been reinvested in the railroads and in keeping the workforce at a level that could provide the kind of service that would have allowed those 100% of the logistics managers to say we get good service rather than saying we don't. There have been some changes in philosophy, I think, among some of the CEOs in the last 3 or 4 years. You know, at one point, after I became chairman, 6 of the 7 CEOs had been changed during my tenure. And I used to like to note that fact, and I would always say is, I was reminded that correlation is not causation. So I don't know why it happened, but it did happen. And some of them have really been much more far-sighted in how they would like to run their railroads. Tracy Robinson at CN, Joe Hendricks has been a star at CSX. I think Katie Farmer is trying to do the right thing. I will tell you that it should come as no surprise that I had CEOs, none of the ones I mentioned, but over the 5 years, pull me aside in private and say, if I didn't do what I'm doing by cutting workforce and so forth, the directors or the shareholders through the directors would fire me and hire somebody who would. And I thought, you know, this is really pretty pathetic. And so you have to give credit to the people like Henry Tracy and so forth for standing up to this crowd. And there's been a recent development, tragic in some ways, at NS, which really proves the point. So Alan Shaw, who spent his life at NS, I think he was there for 30 years, became CEO in mid to late 2022. And in December of 2022, famously announced a plan that he referred to as resilience, that he was no longer going to have layoffs every time trade levels dipped and then try to take people off furloughs and so forth. This was almost revolutionary at the time. And he was really talking about building for the long term. And he opened up some new intermodal lanes and so forth. And he was doing an absolutely great job at setting a trend. He wasn't the only one, but he was under tremendous pressure not to do this. And he pursued it anyway. And then, of course, we had this little hedge fund in Cleveland, and Cora, just about, I guess about a year ago, right, when it started, that decided to wage a proxy fight. And I got a letter from Ancora. So what happened was I got a call from Trains Magazine when this thing hit the fan, and I gave them an interview saying this didn't sound good. And then I got a letter from Ancora saying they'd really like to meet with me, explain what they were doing. I wrote them back immediately, said, I'm all yours. I never heard from them again. But they proceeded to wage this battle. And in the course of fending off the proxy battle, Shaw made some major changes. He brought in John Orr as their chief operating officer. And John is a very good chief operating officer, but the mandate was to really drill down on PSR in a way that's, in my view, not necessarily constructive. He cut out 4 or 5 of his smaller intermodal lanes that he was trying to build. He went the other direction and did some other cuts. So he survived the proxy battle, but only by, you know, adopting some of the measures that Ancora was pushing for. So it was a little bit disheartening, although I had a lot of confidence that Shaw would persist in what he thought was the best interest of the railroad. And then we had this completely unrelated event of 3 or 4 weeks ago, which is really unfortunate in a lot of reasons. I certainly don't defend it. I don't know anybody who does. And Shaw, you know, left the CEO. Who did Norfolk Southern hire? And do we think the 3 new board members from Ancora had anything to do with the type of person to become CEO? They hired Mark George. I've never met him, don't know anything about him other than what I read in Trains Magazine. He's not a railroader. He was their CFO, and he'd only been there for 5 years. Here is what he said 2 weeks ago in his first interview, the first one I know of, after becoming CEO. I quoted it down. It's from Bill Stevens' article, and Bill is one of the best reporters I ever ran into in the railroad. Quote, we have got to focus on earnings growth in dollars. This will generate a lot of free cash flow, which then allows for share repurchases to help drive earnings per share growth at a faster rate than the profit growth, end quote. So when the US DOT says that rail is gonna reduce its share of freight by 4% in the next 25 years, this is the leadership that's gonna get us there. He's probably trying to beat the 4% number. So I at least give him credit for candor. And he's probably a very fine person as a human being, but as a railroad CEO, this is the wrong direction. You know, you probably may know that I had some public disagreements with my friend Jim Bennett at UP, who has followed a similar approach. I don't think he's quite as candid as this other fellow, but if you look at what they're doing there, it's not much different. And BN does seem to be facing this pressure from Omaha, but hopefully, Katie was well mentored by, I just blanked out. No, Matt Rose. Yeah, and I think she's a very impressive CEO, and I hope she'll keep moving. And certainly at CSX and CN and CPK, CS, things are brighter in terms of corporate philosophy anyway. So what do we do about this? I realize I'm speaking a little longer than I thought, so let me talk a little bit about what I learned. And then, because I really want to allow time for discussion. First of all, I can't overstate how little actual real world authority the STB has to counter these trends. It didn't really have the kind of authority it needed even in the old ICC days for this. It really mainly used the authority just to control the rates. But in terms of stimulating growth, it's just not, there aren't many tools available. But I also learned that if you just look at the existing status of the rail industry, it is very, very difficult, whether we're drafting regulations or deciding adversarial cases, and I'll mention a couple of them. It's very complicated and almost impossible for the government to intervene in the market in a granular way. And I've never been shy, I've never been hesitant about trying to take action to solve problems. But when you're really charged with the responsibility and you sit down and say, well, here's a good idea, what if we do it this way? There's almost always unintended consequences. Unfortunately, we had some really terrific people at the board who were expert in the field, and so it takes a long time. And I would propose ideas, and then we'd have really heated discussions about trying to sort it out so we didn't screw up the works. And so when I said at the beginning, I learned a great deal of humility about what government can actually do. It's a big difference of being on the outside, whether we're talking about people running for president or in the Senate, or in my case, running the STB, say, here's what you should do, and then you sit down and do it, and you realize it's a problem. A lot of it just requires common sense as well as a very detailed analysis and understanding railroad operations. Having said that, it is possible to take some action. One of the great frustrations I had was trying to put some meat on the bones of the common carrier obligation. And if I had a good idea on how to write a regulation or a statute to do that, I would have done it. And I've tried. I got a lot of drafts sitting around that I end up throwing away. But there's one interesting case that if any of you are interested in the common carrier obligation, you might want to look at. There was a case the board decided last year in the spring called NTEC. NTEC is a coal mining company owned by the Navajo Nation. I guess it's either I think it's on the Montana, Wyoming, it's somewhere out in the Powder River area. And they were sole served by BN, still are by BN. And BN, they went out from under their contract for complex reasons and went under tariff. And then BN was not willing to give them the number of trains they, in my view, reasonably requested every month, somewhere around 30 a month. They were giving about half that many. So they brought an injunction case in front of the board under the common carrier doctrine for us to order BN to provide the service that they, quote, had reasonably requested. And it caused, we had, this is interesting, by the little internal STB politics. The staff at the STB doesn't like public hearings. I don't mind by saying that. They had almost none. And I believe in public hearings because that was my life earlier. And I also think we owe it to the public to let people hear what we're doing. They were going to decide the case on paper. And the record on paper, by the way, the lawyering in front of the STB is woeful. Woeful. And this is a bunch of very smart, highly paid lawyers. That's another subject we can talk about at this time. The paper that was filed was, you couldn't decide the case, in my sense, in any meaningful way. I am a trial lawyer in my other life, and so I believe in facts and a record and finding out what the hell's really going on. I said, we're gonna have a hearing on this. Oh my God, it'll be terrible. So we had a hearing, and the lawyering continued to be inadequate, so I did a lot of the questioning, which I got criticized for, which was fine because it meant I was getting to the heart of it. And it became clear to me, I don't want to comment too much on stuff that's not in the record, but if you read the decision, and it was one of the very few 3-2 decisions of the board during the time I was chairman. I think there were only 2 or 3. And I'll talk about that in a second. The decision lays out why the board actually issued the injunction to order BN to produce these trains. To my knowledge, it was the first injunction ever issued by the STB. Nobody ever found an injunction case going back 100 years, one way or the other. There may be one because the record keeping wasn't great. And my 2 Republican friends, who are indeed are close friends and excellent people on the board, Patrick Fuchs and Shel Schultz, could not go along with the issuing an injunction, and they wrote very long dissents. And the whole thing is worth reading because it's a very good discussion of the debate of about the government ordering a railroad to do something, because the whole system is a network, as we know. Even within one railroad, it's a network, much less interchanging with others, and in this case, working with the port, which could all this coal, export coal. And there's a great deal of trepidation. I said, oh, if we order them to move this train there, then who's gonna not get a train over here? And we had a lot of evidence on it, enough, I thought, to allow us to issue the injunction. It caused my other friends some reluctance, and so they were unwilling to do it. But the discussion in those decisions really will enlighten you on why this is so hard for the government to come in and order railroads to do anything granularly. We did, by the way, twice, I guess, or maybe 3 times, issue emergency orders against the Union Pacific, and these were unanimous last year against to serve Foster Farms, the big poultry producer in California. But that was not, this injunction was for a whole year's worth of train on the coal. The UP case, just get the trains there this week because the chickens are gonna die. 1 million chickens a day, as I recall. That's a lot of dead chickens. Anyway, and we had decisions on those too. They weren't as fully fleshed out, but it is very difficult. And I can talk about a lot of other things we did, rulemakings and so forth. There isn't really time. Bottom line to me is that I became very impressed with the fact that there is no comparison to optimize efficiency and serving a market to having actual competition. I don't care if it's Burger King and McDonald's or railroads. Letting a truly free, competitive market operate is almost always going to produce the best optimization of society's resources in every circumstance. The problem with that, of course, is that there is no real competition in the rail industry, and there isn't ever going to be any because they're not going to build any more new railroads. And so, you know, trucks, AAR always comes in and says, well, trucks, a lot of our people, you know, have to compete with trucks. We don't want them competing with trucks as a matter of policy. We don't want trucks to come in and lower their rates and have better service and then have all that greenhouse gas. And even if they go to a fully electric truck fleet, which will probably happen, the safety on highways is dismal compared to rail. I think Oliver Wyman estimated, don't hold me to this number, that if the railroads don't pick up their share of that freight growth and it goes to truck, there'll be something like 16,000 additional highway deaths in the next 25 years just from that factor. If that's not the right number, it's a large number. So we don't want, as a matter of policy, trucks to be competitive to railroads for that in the sense of shifting freight between one source or the other. And until they all become electric, of course, there's a terrible problem with greenhouse gases, as well as tearing up the highways with an 80,000 pound, imagine hundreds of thousands of these 80,000 pound semis. They just tear up the highway so fiercely, and that costs society money. So I don't have any great solutions to this problem. But what I do think, and I actually spent a fair amount of my last year there, and I never came up with a good answer, or I would have voiced it. I think as a society, and we have to do it through our Congress, we have to come to grips with this. What do we want to do? Do we want to have an economy that will grow by 50% in the next 25 years and be globally competitive? And if we do, and do we want to have onshoring and nearshoring to avoid the supply chain crisis, which is happening anyway? So much is going on in Mexico, Donald Trump to the contrary notwithstanding. That can't happen without rail. That was the beauty of the CP-KCS merger, and then CN and UP and others saying, hey, we better get in on some of this. That's good. But they're not going to be able to handle the increases if they continue, as I've talked about. So we as a society have to decide, what are we going to do? Are we going to tell our Congress to say to the Staggers Act, thank you very much, you were a big help in 1980, now we're going to redo the whole thing? And are we willing, because the railroads on their own are not going to spend the money on infrastructure. You can tell that from the CREATE project. You know, I find the CREATE project very exhilarating and frustrating at the same time. If you look at who benefits, and Norm actually probably correct me, I'm probably going to get this wrong. By the way, everything I did at Metro that was wrong was Norm's fault, because I learned it from him. But if you look at the CREATE projects, I found this out, I did not know this at the time, but I found it out recently, that each project kind of gets, the funding of it gets negotiated separately. There isn't a continuous funding formula, but it always comes out about the same. And what comes out is that the class ones pay about 25% of the cost, and Metro, Amtrak, city, county, state, feds, all public money pays for the other 75%. And I am sure, and Norm will correct me on this, that the freights get more than 25% of the benefit. And I have asked the question, well, why don't we tell them to pay more? And the answer, not from them, but from the other people involved, is they would say, well, then we just don't have the project. If you want us to pay 50% or 42%, we'll live the way it is. They're just not that interested. So it's clear, and by the way, what would be a good idea would be to have a national CREATE concept. But you still have to figure out how you're going to make it work. And somehow or another, I think this is a problem for the Congress. But if we do that as a society, to say we don't want to spend $332 billion on highways, we want to spend it on rail, and at least that part that relates to moving freight, then there's going to have to be some trade-offs. If you just say we're going to start, as the Biden administration has done very well in the infrastructure bill and so forth, spending more money, a lot of it's on rail infrastructure. But if you don't do anything more than that in the long haul, that will just give the freights more, quote, free cash for buybacks. So I'm not interested in taxpayers spending billions on rail infrastructure so that the buybacks can get higher and more. So there has to be some more limitation on how the railroads operate. And there you have communist, Marxist, Baptist, whatever the current phrase is, on how do you get from here to there. I don't have the answer, but I do have the question, as I said at the outset, and we have to grapple with it, because if we don't grapple with it, 20 years from now, the next former chairman of the SDB will be up there telling you about free cash flow and stock buybacks and labor cuts and so forth. I don't see it changing on its own. So with that, let me stop, if I'd love to have some discussion if you're interested. And by the way, I didn't talk about reciprocal switching or our final offer rate review thing, which was thrown out by the federal courts a month ago, the rate matter, and reciprocal switching is immediately challenged in the Seventh Circuit. It hasn't been ruled on yet. We can talk about all of those things too, if you like. But I wanted to talk about these broader policies.
You just invited yourself back for another session next year.
Well, we'll have some more court rulings by then.
What we're going to do with the Q&A is we're going to take the questions here in the room first, and we have a full capacity room almost. Those of you that are online, please send a chat message that you have a question, and then Brett will acknowledge, we'll call you, and then you will read your question into the record. Number one. Number two, I neglected to mention a very important fact this morning or earlier today. This is a joint meeting with the Transportation Seminar Center Seminar Series and Sandhouse. The reason all of these students are here, and God bless you for coming, is because they are students with some degree of transportation, and this is their seminar series that's conducted regularly on a transportation topic.
Well, I hope that devoting so much time to listening to me doesn't lower your grade point.
I have to tell one story about Marty. For some reason at the Metro board meeting, we were talking about the service on Metro Electric. And I said that the Illinois Central established the first commuter service in Chicago, and that was occurred on July 26, 1856. Without a beat, he said, the reason Norm knows that, he was on the train. So with that, are there any questions? And Professor Joe is going to lead us off.
I'll try to lead you off. So it sounded to me, Marty, like you're taking us to the Congress to re-regulate the railroads. I don't object to that, but I'm really curious. Can you envision what that re-regulation might look like? That would address the growth problem that you raised?
I wouldn't use the word re-regulate, Joe. First of all, it's a political, landmine to even mention those.
But you're out of politics now, Steve.
I know, but if I mentioned them in Washington, the idea would die instantly. And I wouldn't recommend re-regulation if it means anything like the old ICC days. This is what I was referring to earlier. I don't think the government can do much really about setting rates. And I don't think the government can tell a railroad how many people to hire. I mean, you can see when they fire 45,000 people, they don't have enough people to run the railroad. And I said frequently, I don't know if they need 5,000 more people, 20,000 more people, 45,000. I have no idea what the number is. And actually, I don't think anybody, even somebody who knew something about railroads, which I don't, knows the answer to that question. So if Congress were so in my view, the main reason for Congress to act is to deal with this long-term growth problem, because that is a major national concern. I would think the way to do it is to set landmarks or goals. So just to give you an example by analogy, and I will talk a little bit here about our reciprocal switching rule. So does everybody have some idea what reciprocal switching is about? So there hasn't been a reciprocal switching order issued by the board in over 40 years because the regulations adopted in the 80s made it virtually impossible for a shipper to prove that they were entitled to get reciprocal switching. So there was a real need to loosen it up, and we tried to really struggle with how to do it. We came up with the idea of setting service goals. So what we said is, if you're a shipper, and I think I remember all the numbers, I think the number was, and you had less than 70% on-time performance over a 3-month period, that would be a ground by itself to come before the board and get a reciprocal switching order for a competing railroad to come in. We didn't tell the railroad they had to get to 70%, and we didn't tell them how to get to 70%. We just said, you gotta get there if you want to avoid a switch. And I'm oversimplifying, but that was sort of, and we had a different standard for the local, spot and pull local service. I think that had to be 85 or 90%, because that's even more crucial. And we also had a standard for transit time. If your transit time reduced by 20% or something over the same period, I think there were three metrics. So that's a good concept to me. And then let the railroads work it out themselves. If the customer who's getting 60% on-time service is so unimportant to the railroad, they won't try. Hopefully somebody else would find that business valuable. I can't make that happen. And you know, one of the things I learned, when I say it's very hard for government to intervene, is to do things incrementally. So let's not try to sweep out everything here and not have any idea what's happened. Let's take this step, and see how it works for a couple of years. And one of our thoughts about this, by the way, if you think about how rail service is delivered in most places, not all places. First of all, on the same local line coming out of a main yard, you may have a dozen shippers. Some of them may be under contract, which means we had no jurisdiction over them, but they're still getting bad service. Some may be an exempt commodity, and some may be under tariff, who our rule applies to. And we were criticized, by the way, when they issued this rule, that only a tiny fraction of the shippers would be able to use the rule. What our thought is that if we could incentivize railroads to do better than 70% on time, that would affect all the shippers on the line. You can't just serve one shipper 70% of the time and then, you know, they're all getting the same local train for the most part and often the same cross-country train. So the idea was by using these markers to incentivize better service. So I know you're taping this, and I don't want to be quoted on this in the halls of Congress because I'm not ready to say this. But suppose, rather than re-regulating in detail, granularity, which I think would be a mistake, suppose we said, you can't pay out any stock buybacks unless you have 70% on-time performance. I think you'd have the shareholders say, get the performance up. I want my money. Now, that's probably not a good way to do it. I don't know enough about capital markets, but I suspect somebody smarter than me could come up with those kinds of instances. So that would be the kind of trade-off. And if the government were going to put the bill for huge infrastructure investments in rail, it seems to me you would tie that to some kind of incentive. I think that's a concept that occurs to me. There may be others. But re-regulating and having the board set rates and try to do other things, that's not good. By the way, let me mention something about rate regulation now. There have been 51 rate cases brought since the Staggers Act was passed. Now, just try to imagine how many millions of times a shipper has shipped something on rail in the last 44 years and been charged too much. And only 51 times has anybody brought a case, and very few of those cases are won. So it's not a good way to set rail rates. If you're a shipper who's being gouged and you're trying to run your business and you bring a rate case, the average rate case, I don't know what it would be today because there's been a few years, cost $5 million and took 5 years. That is not a very good way to run your plant. You can't plan on that. You can't decide, you know, if you want to use truck, if that's your only availability while you're waiting for a case. And nobody's come up. We did come up with an idea with this final offer rate review mechanism. That was a greatly condensed procedure, but even that would take 90 months. And the Court of Appeals just threw it out, saying we didn't have authority to do what Congress told us to do, which was to come up with a simplified rate review measure. So we said, fine, here's the best one we can come up with. I said, no, you can't, you don't have authority to do that either. So, you know, I'm not too exuberant about micromanaging rates or even other aspects of rail operations. But it's a very good question, Joe, and I would challenge all the geniuses in your program to work on this idea and come up with a good concept that we could take to Congress and have people start thinking about it. Yes, and then over here, with that.
Well, reciprocal switching been.
They can't hear him remotely.
Okay.
You hand the microphone back. As I understand, reciprocal switching's been in place in Canada for a number of years. The railroads haven't shut down in Canada. So, and I know their regulatory situation is different and so on, but, they have pretty much enforced the ability, as I understand it.
Well, Canada is instructive to some degree. By the way, Canada also has this final offer rate system too. We learned a lot from Canada. Canada is very, very different. When the Canadian railroad systems were built 120 years ago, a lot of, much of the system was built with the idea that they didn't want to duplicate infrastructure. And they built reciprocal switching into the way, pretty much, I'm oversimplifying, but when you compare that with the spaghetti bowl in the eastern half of the country, it's just a different layout. It will still work. There's not any question in my mind that even a much broader, I mean, if I ran the zoo, 25 years ago, the great STV was down to one person, Roger Nober, the great guy. And so I always used to think, if I were Roger Nober, I'd just pass any rule I only need one vote. Truth is, he was very wisely restrained in not doing that. And hopefully I would have had the same wisdom. It's not a good way to govern when you've got Congress saying you need 5 people to do this. Having said that, in some ideal world, I think you should seriously consider just opening up reciprocal switching. Anybody who has access to another railroad have a chance to go ahead and let competition be the driver. The railroads that complain about reciprocal switching, there's a simple answer to it. Don't do it. Give them good service and good prices, and you won't have this problem. They're basically saying, no, we like being a monopoly. And I don't think there's much justification for that. And this is one of those things, having just said I'd open it up, you wouldn't open it up. It could cause operational difficulties, but you could make it much broader than even our limited approach. And I stayed at the board, I would have been very interested as a citizen to see if this goes into effect, how it pans out over the next year or two. We said in the order, and I said in speeches, that this was the first step. And once we showed this could work, then there would be a basis to broaden it. By the way, if you ever want to have a good laugh, go on YouTube and look for the animated video prepared by the AAR about reciprocal switching. It is the funniest thing you've ever seen. It shows that a switch would take something like 78 or some ridiculous number of moves just to get a car from one plant to the other railroad. It is absolutely absurd. It defeats itself. I was considering using that video at our hearings on it to put in the record so I could show to a court how stupid the opposition was. But I was talked out of it. So there's the two extremes. So Canada has some lessons about how they've done it, but their system is much simpler to operate. Yes, Eric.
Let's see if I can get this. Help? Oh, I get it. Is there any way around the commercially sensitive information and the secrecy that goes on at the STV hearings? I watched the Gulf Coast hearing. I knew a lot of things that they wouldn't want to talk about. None of the parties wanted to talk about. Amtrak, CSX. Is there any way around that? Because I think you knew the facts that weren't being said, so why can't they be out? Why is there this commercially sensitive issue?
It's a very good question. And the answer is not so much, is there a way around it, but is there a way to restrain the excessive use of confidentiality? So every court, every adjudicatory body has provisions for keeping proprietary information secret. So if you go over to the federal court in a patent infringement trial or an antitrust case, a lot of the evidence gets filed under seal because it's proprietary to the business. And it's really up to the tribunal, in this case, with STB, to, if somebody challenges it, to assess whether that material really needs to be kept confidential and to restrain it. Parties are always way over designating. I found it as a private lawyer. They did. I didn't usually care because it's a private case. I just needed the information to win the case. But the STB is not only a public body, but in something like the Gulf Coast case and in virtually everything else the STB does, but specifically in Gulf Coast, the Congress charged us with protecting the public interest. And so I felt all along during those hearings that the public had a right to know. And we did actually limit some of the confidentiality. And when we didn't do it officially, we strongly encouraged the parties to not insist on confidentiality during the course of the hearing. They did sometimes. And what was frustrating is that because it's an adversarial process, you depend on one party to challenge the other party's confidentiality. Here, they're both Amtrak and I'm going to take this opportunity to comment on something that I didn't get a chance to say in our final ruling because the case settled. So that's an interesting case legally, by the way. Almost everything that the STB does under the statute in terms of hearings, whether it's a rate hearing or a rulemaking hearing, although this is just briefly a challenge by the 8th Circuit, which suffered point, are administrative hearings. They're not formal trials. And the system's sort of designed that way. And it's better because informal proceedings allow you to move somewhat faster and get a decision. You know, unlike a court, the STB is overseeing an ongoing business operation that's supporting the economy. And so, like the injunction case or the Gulf Coast case, you got to keep things moving. You can't just take years, although many cases do take years. But under the statutes, the case that Amtrak filed to get access to the Gulf Coast line was designated by Congress to be a case that required a formal trial with sworn testimony, cross-examination, and all of it. And that statute had never been invoked in its entire history since 1970 or whenever it was passed. So this was the first time the board had to conduct a trial. And when the case came in, the staff immediately said to me, well, you'll want to refer this out to an ALJ, an administrative law judge, and they'll try the case. I'm a trial lawyer by training. I didn't want to throw it out. But interestingly enough, there are two other lawyers on the board, but they're not trial lawyers. Karen Hedlund, Michelle Schultz are both very accomplished lawyers. And the other two are not trained as lawyers, but I used to say Patrick Fuchs was actually the best lawyer on the board. He has a wonderful mind. And so I talked to them, they said, no, we should try this case. Because A, it was the first one. Everybody on the board is very much involved and is committed in some sense or another to passenger rail. And it was a huge policy question of how we were going to resolve it. So early on, they said, no, we're going to try the case. So this gave staff heartburn, as you might imagine. And everything was going along fine until about 2 or 3 weeks before the hearing. And the other board members said to me, so Marty, we don't know anything about trying cases. How do you try a case? And they said, well, you're a trial lawyer, you try the case. So I said, well, here's what we'll do. every ruling, so evidentiary rulings, for example, I said, it's a board decision, so I'll act like a chief judge, but I'm gonna turn to you all if I make a ruling and say, you agree, and 99% of the time, they did. But we also had a discussion about the paper that had been filed. And the paper that had been filed, this contributes to my previous generalized statement about the local tradition of lawyering in front of the board. So, let me see if I can put this, you might find this interesting, I don't want to use up too much time. I'll try to say it simply. Under the statute, the railroads had the burden of proving that running passenger trains would I think the words were unreasonably interfere with freight service or something like that. And the statute clearly said that they had the burden of proof. So the railroads filed paper, after Amtrak sued, the railroads filed a lot of papers and said they were gonna have an RTC study. RTC? Yeah. And show us all this stuff and so forth. And Amtrak found no evidence of early, before the trial. And we had some pre-trial conferences which were public. And I said to Amtrak's lawyers, where's your evidence? We don't have any. I said, well, they said, we don't think that the railroads have made a prima facie case, and therefore under the statute, they will lose. And we won't have to put on any evidence. And technically, that's true at the end of their case. But I've tried a lot of cases in which the defendant likes to say, you didn't meet your burden of proof, but they're ready to go when the judge said, yes, they did. You put your case on. And I said that to Amtrak's lawyers. I said, well, I don't know how it's going to come out, but suppose the board rules they have made a prima facie case. What are you going to do then? And they had no answer. And I was quite concerned for the public interest part. Because if we found that the railroads had made a prima facie case, and Amtrak had no evidence, we would have been required to deny access, and therefore there would have been no passenger service there. I was pretty upset about it. So they finally came up with some, I don't want to call it evidence, but I will for the sake of this discussion. And, but I remember saying, this is the long point of it, I remember saying to the other board members who hadn't tried cases, and we're very frustrated that we didn't have it. Really, we didn't have the input from both sides. Even the railroads who had the RTC study, they had a lot of holes in it, put it that way. And I remember saying to my fellow board members, I said, so this is the kind of situation which if you had really good trial lawyers, they would ferret out the truth for the court, for us to reach a decision. That's what trial lawyers are supposed to do. This is the one good reason why. So it doesn't really work at the SDV. I said, but we don't have good trial lawyers. And so we're gonna have to do this ourselves. And we did. And I did a lot of questioning at that hearing. And I got a lot of pushback from the lawyers for the railroad, which didn't push me back at all, but didn't make them happy. But it included, by the way, some of this included some arguments over confidentiality. But it was, and then, by the way, that case dragged on for 11 days of trial over about 6 months. And the only reason it settled is that I announced that the board was going to meet in 2 weeks and vote on it. Shortly thereafter, they settled before we had that meeting. I said, I hinted, without saying directly, that neither side would be happy. and that helped. Anyway, you make a very good point. We're a public body, and as much as possible, information should be made public. The railroads, by the way, these monopolists say, oh, we can't reveal this kind of information. Our competitors will grab it. Who exactly are they talking about? I'm not clear in most cases, but that's the argument always.
Hi, I'm Larry Jordan. I'm CEO of Electronics, or a rail industry supplier. And going on the theme of looking to other countries and how they address some of these issues, in Australia, at least in part of it, there's a company that owns the rail, and then there's other companies that I guess lease or pay fees to use the network. So I was wondering if you could give some insight on what you think about that and how that might, help our situation in the US.
Australia is also the only place that I know of that has a 240-mile long unmanned railway. Which I have looked into, and it seems to work, by the way, but it goes from one mine to one port and back, that's all it does. I don't think it can navigate the EJ&E, very well. I haven't spent much time thinking about that. The very first question would be, assuming it would be a good idea for the government to own the right away. Can you imagine what it would cost under eminent domain to acquire all the rail right away in this country? Trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. That'll never happen. And I don't know how else you would do it. I mean, you can't just take it. That's unconstitutional. So it'd be cheaper for the government to invest on conditions, in my view, on more infrastructure. I think in Europe, a lot of the rail is also owned by the government, and then the operators lease it or pay fees. If it had started out that, it's a little late back in 1862. If Lincoln wasn't busy with something else, he might have set up that system. But I think it's too late to do it now.
Hey, Marty.
Dave.
Dave Lundy. Quick question. Well, okay, it's not really a quick question. So what you described is a calcified industry with a broken regulatory system that is not meeting the needs of the public. And monopolies, you're exactly right. Monopolies tend to monopolize, and they behave like monopolies. And the only way to get them to change their behavior is you either order them to change their behavior or you incentivize to change their behavior. And you described one such incentive. So just for a moment, pretend you're God. You are the rail god.
I've been accused of that already, not for a moment.
Yes. You're the rail god. What are the first two things you're going to do to change the system to encourage this to be more productive?
Boy, I don't think I can answer that question. In my advanced age of observing human behavior, I don't think I've ever seen anything that motivates people to work hard other than the profit motive. And so if you start ordering them to do things that don't have to do with whether they're making a profit, I'm not sure we would incentivize good behavior. So I think we have to figure out another way to do it. And as I said, if I had a good answer, I will, I would have done it. I will tell you that some people, I think Rick Patterson is one who has said, but I think this isn't very reliable for the long term, but he has said that there does seem to be a shift in Wall Street away from the hedge funds towards longer term investors, and that investors are beginning to recognize, I haven't really seen it on this latest statement from the new NS CEO, would be contrary. But I think he made the observation last week that some investors are beginning to realize that cutting labor has gone down as far as it can. And if they want to increase profits and therefore buybacks and dividends, they're going to have to increase volume. But they've finally begun to realize that's the only way out. Even if that's true, I didn't hear anybody say, and yes, we're going to increase volume by 50%. To take into account the next 25 years, it might be just enough to get their return up to other comparative investments that they could make. So it's a very good question. And I don't have a good answer. The only thing I could come up with is setting some kind of standards under similar to the concept of the common carrier obligation, and then giving shippers relief if those standards aren't met. In theory, if you think about how the private system works in other industries, if you said that under the common, that when a railroad we actually do say this now, nobody's ever tried it. Under the common carrier obligation, if you don't provide the service on reasonable request, the person who requested the service can sue not only to get the service, but for damages. So, and in the NTEC case, they didn't try it. They didn't think they had a boilerplate request, but the case ended up settling after we issued the injunction. But imagine if they, quote, reasonably requested 30 coal trains a month and they only got 20 or whatever it was. And they could collect the lost profits on the 10 trains they didn't get. That'd be pretty good incentive. And I think that's possible under the law now, in theory. I don't think anybody's ever done it. And imagine the challenge of proving what does the common carrier obligation require. The only reason I think, I'll take a little credit there, that I thought the NTEC decision was a solid one under deciding what the common carrier obligation required is I asked the BN representative right at the beginning of that hearing if he agreed that under the common carrier obligation, if the railroad had the capacity to provide the service, they were required to provide it. And he said yes. We then spent the next, I don't know, many hours dissecting whether they had the capacity. And everything they said in their papers about why they didn't want to provide these trains on cross-examination turned out to not hold up. So at the end of it, it was pretty clear that for much of the relief NTEC had answered and asked for, BN had conceded they had the capacity. Which was why I then argued that, well, if you've got the capacity and you admit that that's what the common carrier obligation requires, do it. They then tried to say, well, we're gonna do it anyway, so you don't need an injunction. So I sort of like that concept, but you need to, because I think the private sector should have enforced this. I will say one thing, we haven't talked about it, we're probably out of time, and I left this out.
Do you have time for 3 more remote questions?
Yeah, listen, I'm retired. I'm gonna go now. I'll say as much as you want. I haven't talked about this, and this is another subject. And there's not much I think government can do about this. I think the shipping world as a whole, there are some exceptions, is equally woeful in advocating for its own best interest. The shippers, in my view, seem to have adopted an attitude of we go to work every day with the railroads we have and not the railroads we wish we have. Somebody said something like that once. And we'll just grin and bear it. We don't have time or money or political capital to do more. So part of me says, well, you know, if you're not gonna fight for it, why should the STB go out of its way to help? If you don't feel the need for it. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. One, you've had an STB an ICC for the last 40 years, which hasn't been very responsive to shippers. So I think prior to the last few years, and it's not just me, I think it was the whole board. So I think a lot of shippers weren't incentivized. The shippers told me that. Why should we bring a case? We can't win them. But also, and this applies, by the way, to the broad-based congressional policy solution. And this was impressed upon me early on when I got at the board. You know, I thought I knew politics pretty well. I do know Chicago politics pretty well. So Washington's a different place, and I spent 5 years trying to learn it. The railroads go to Congress or to a friendly FRA when there is one, or a friendly STB in unison. They all have exactly the same interest, and they have only one interest, and that is to be left alone. The shippers have a wide variety of interests. Dow Chemical has a lot more concerns about what the EPA is doing. ADM has a lot more concerns about grain exports, and just take every industry. They've all got very different interests in addition to rail service. So their political effort is diffuse. It's also not their highest priority. I wouldn't tell you if I could remember, and I can't remember who it was, but I've had logistics managers from very large shippers tell me, you know, we come to the board, the logistics managers, and we want help and so forth, but when it comes to filing a case or getting really heavily involved in a rulemaking, the message we get from the top is, we got bigger fish to fry. Just do the best you can. And so that's their choice, you know, they're private companies. But I do wonder if some of these large industries that we depend on to have a thriving economy, and may also be calcified over the next 25 years. And so everybody's happy to live with a suboptimal system. Now, it's hard to be too critical. We do have the best economy in the world. It's just clear to me, it could be a much better economy. And I will just finish this on shippers. And I started telling this to railroads. After we started traveling again, after the pandemic, after the vaccinations came out, and all the railroads had told me, you know, we, laid off workers and there was no shipping and so forth. I started asking shippers two things, whether they'd laid off anybody, and almost none of them had. Then I started asking shippers, if they had an ideal world of rail and they had access to unlimited rail service, timely service, unlimited boxcars, that some are shortage of boxcars and so forth, could you and would you produce more widgets and sell more widgets? And what was interesting is that oftentimes the beginning of that discussion, the person I was asking would have a look on his face like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I would have to pursue it and press it. And I say, no, right now you ship 10 boxcars a week or whatever you're making. Would you make more of that stuff if you could get 20 boxcars a week? Is your factory big enough to produce the stuff? And is there a market for it? And every single shipper, when I finally got them to think about the question I was asking, said, yes, of course I could sell more. But this is as much as I can move. So that's what I produce. So it seems to me, and I've said this before publicly, that the railroads are depressant on the overall economic output. But then you want to say to the shippers, well, why aren't you pounding on the door? And I will just tell you one more story. I'm still going to handle these questions. The only time I've seen that happen was a year and a half ago in the soda ash industry. I didn't know anything about the soda ash industry, but this soda ash comes from a rock, which I forgot the name of. It's far underground. And almost all of the soda ash, if not all of it in this country and most of it in the world, is in southwestern Wyoming. Very far underground in layers like coal, veins. And there are 5 gigantic mining companies there. 4 of them are foreign. One's Indian, one's Turkish, one's in the Netherlands, one's American, I can't remember the 5th one. And they produce, I think, something like 100,000 carloads of soda ash every year. Soda ash, by the way, after it's mined, they have these big factories and processed, is basically baking soda. And it is used in a lot of places, including the manufacture of every kind of glass that there is. So a drinking glass, a window, all glass needs soda ash. And these mines are sole served by Union Pacific. And they get okay service. They're all unit trains. But for the last few years, apparently the worldwide soda ash market has been exploding. And by the way, lithium batteries require soda ash. So that's a whole new market as we go to electric vehicles. And so they've been going to UP because cumulatively, don't hold me to these numbers, I think they told us they were going to invest $5 billion over the next 5 or 6 years to almost double the output of these mines by opening up new veins and so forth. But they can't do it if they can't move the stuff out of southwest Wyoming, which is not near anything. And so they went to UP repeatedly and kept getting the brush off. UP would say, don't you worry about us. We'll be there if you need us. And these people were saying, yeah, but the board of directors in Turkey isn't going to send me $1 billion unless they have some concrete reason to rely on your ability to move it. So they kept nagging the board to come out for a visit. And finally, all of us, all 5 board members and about 10 staff people went on a tour of southwest Wyoming. We spent about 3 or 4 days there. It was absolutely fascinating. And what was equally fascinating is that UP knew we were coming. And they still left some trains sitting there uncrewed. It was really stunning. But after we left, we heard, Lance was still CEO at the time, that they were starting to respond. But one thing piece of credit I will give Jim Benna, almost immediately after he became CEO, he sent the crew out there with a very detailed infrastructure plan for how to move these, I think it's an additional 100,000 carloads a year. And the mines told me late last year they were very happy. And I later said to Jim Benna, you know, it isn't going to work if every factory in the United States has to get a visit from the entire STB in order to get growth. That just won't, we can't do it that way. I didn't get a good answer. So there's an example of an industry which did champion its cause, so it could grow. But I don't see that happening in too many other places. I'm sorry, 3 more.
That's
Any
all right.
more
So-
questions? I don't care.
We're gonna take 3 more online
Okay.
questions. We're running beyond
Okay.
schedule right now,
Okay.
but we're gonna take 3 more questions from David Allen, Tom Corneli, and Kevin Brubaker. And David, you're up.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
I
we
can,
can.
yes.
Okay,
Uh-huh.
David Peter Allen, contributing editor at Railway Age. I covered the entire Second Battle of Mobile from before the public hearings and through the entire trial. And as a lawyer myself, I can really say that everything you said, Marty, on the legal issues you addressed today made a lot of sense to me. And I was very impressed with the way you handled that entire case. And thank you for doing it so well. My question is this: now that the board has gotten somewhat involved with the passenger rail side, with Mobile, with on-time performance on the Sunset Limited, with the disputes between CN and Amtrak on the Grand Trunk and the IC, I guess a 2-part question. Where do you see the board going with respect to rail passenger service, particularly on Amtrak? And also, what do you see as the board's mission toward improving rail passenger service, especially for the rider's experience?
Oh, those are great questions. Let me first return the compliment and tell you that I thought your coverage of the issue was fantastic, and it was very frequently I learned things from your articles that the parties never told us about.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I think it was a great service. Well, the board, a few things. Number one, as I think you all know, the board has been charged with enforcing the new on-time performance regulations that, were bandied about in court for years and finally went into effect. And because of that, I actually created a whole new division at the board to solely handle the rail passenger issues. And it's headed by a person who probably knows more about Amtrak and freight rail than anybody on the planet, Neil Moyer. Hopefully he'll be there for a while and continue to run it. I know a little bit more about what's going on the Sunset Limited case than I'm probably allowed to talk about, but I can tell you this, that's the first case that Amtrak brought under the new regulations. it turns out that enforcing the on-time performance regulations and because one of the things that's required is that for every freight, every delay or every lack of getting there on time, somebody has to determine the proximate cause of why that happened. You know, Amtrak is not perfect. And not every delay is caused by a freight, and not every delay that's caused by a freight is actionable. And so sorting all of that out has, from what I understand, taking an inordinate amount of time. My hope would be that once this case is litigated, they'll set down some templates for how these things can be litigated in the future, and they will move much faster. But they really are inventing the wheel. These cases have never been brought before. The current 4 board members, to my knowledge, who I work with closely, are all committed to their passenger rail responsibility. So I think it will be taken seriously. I do think that there are some very difficult policy issues that have to be decided. Probably the most difficult one, because it's not defined in the statute, is what exactly does preference mean? Does it mean that every time there is a freight train in front of an Amtrak train, it must get out of the way? And what does that mean if there aren't any sidings for it to get out of the way into? I don't think you can have an absolute rule one way or the other. I don't have if I had an opinion, I wouldn't express it, but I don't, on how that dilemma should be decided. But it is a very sticky issue that will kind of go to the heart of the future of the interaction between Amtrak and passenger rail. The freight railroads going forward. So I think the board is going to take a very, very hard look at how to decide that issue among others. But I'm convinced that, you know, things will improve once the board comes to grip with how to enforce these on-time performance. But it's not simple. You know, just have to express one of my great frustrations. When the Congress created Amtrak in 1970 and said, okay, you're off the hook for common carrier movement of passengers, you just have to let us on your system with Amtrak. What they forgot to do was to give somebody, at that time should have been the ICC, authority to review railroads' removal of infrastructure. They didn't. So the ST, if you want to abandon an unused 10 feet of railroad in the middle of a forest that's rusted out, you can't do it without coming to the STB. If you want to pull up 300 miles of double tracking between Chicago and Carbondale, which Hunter Harrison did in the 1990s, no problem. Don't have to ask any questions. So now I rode the Saluki up in the front end 3 years ago, and it's single track all the way from Chicago to Carbondale with a few sidings. We were put on sidings 4 times. So that's the problem. So, you know, in a broad sense, the freight rail are like the fellow who murders his parents and then asks for mercy as an orphan. You know, to build up all the infrastructure, so how are we gonna run on-time performance? We don't have enough track. Anyway, that's a bigger question for Congress to grapple with as well.
All right, Tom asked me to ask his question. In regards to the decline of carload freight, what research do you think would be helpful to understanding the impact of railroads' use of pricing to actively demarket certain segments of carload freight in the context of wider marketplace changes?
I'm not a data maven. I'd love to see some research on that because all I have is anecdotal evidence of shippers from practically the first day I was at the board coming in to informally talk to me and probably other board members and saying, I've been demarketed. They priced me out. And I have plenty of traffic, but you know, the way they're serving me, I can't afford it. Probably surveying, you know, the market, getting the trade. One thing that the trade associations, the chemical people, the grain people do is that they do pretty good surveys of their members. Perhaps getting them to do some more detailed surveys to get that data. But you know, individual shippers are very loath to come forward because they're absolutely convinced they're being retaliated against. So a lot of times when I would get these reports from shippers, I'd ask them to do something about it, and they said, "You can't do anything about it. We just wanted you to know." You know, I said, "Well, I can't do anything, you know, for you. I can't issue a board order saying, well, I heard in the hallway that there's a problem, you know, but they're afraid, reasonably, I think, afraid of retaliation. So I think the trade associations probably would have to gather the data, but I'm not a data analyst or structural person on how to gather it.
All right, let's go to our last question then. Kevin, you're up. Please let us know who you are.
Good afternoon, Kevin Brubaker with the Environmental Law and Policy Center. You've painted a compelling and disturbing picture of the growth of trucking and the stagnation of railroading because of railroads' monopoly powers. I'm curious your thoughts on an additional factor being the both direct and indirect subsidies we provide to the trucking industry in this country. Is that creating the market where dollars are flowing in the wrong direction?
Well, do you mean by the gas tax and so forth?
Gas tax, the fact that truckers don't pay property tax on the right of way they use, the fact that truckers don't have to pay for capacity that they're not using while railroads do. I mean, to some extent, the railroads would argue that they're competing with one hand tied behind their back because of tax policy.
Well, they always do. It is a myth that the railroads aren't subsidized. Most of them got their land for free a long time ago. So I always, you know, look a little scant at that moaning and groaning. Having said that, certainly one way to disincentivize trucking would be to raise the gas tax, make the rates a lot higher and make rail more attractive. But I think it is a bigger problem than just, you know, one answer. And you know, everybody uses the roads in addition to the trucks. It becomes a very complicated political issue. But certainly, that is an area that should be, I don't disagree that government is in a position to disincentivize the use of trucks through how it deals with trucks. I don't have many more answers other than gas tax, but I certainly would favor increasing it. And then, of course, as they become electors, you're going to have to go to the, what's the name of the new tax? Mileage tax. So if you have additional answers, I'd like to hear them. And be sure to say hello to Howard for me.
Will do. Thank you so much for your thoughts on that.
All right. Thank you for listening. All right. So am I done?
You're done.
Thank you all.
Marty, this was great. We have 150% of the usual attendance. So people are very interested in hearing from you despite what you were concerned about. And we are going to invite you back in 2025.
All right, right. I'm still around. I'll be here.
A couple of additions, if I may. The other thing that BNSF is doing under Katie Farmer is at division points where they change crews, they are building fueling stations and they are building third and fourth main tracks. So when the train comes in, they leave the locomotive on the train, fuel it, change the crews, and in the case of manifest trains that are slower, the intermodal train that's following the manifest will pull out ahead of it. So that also is creating track capacity because now you do not have to cross over the intermodal train and go against the current of traffic on the other track. Personal opinion, I think they're going to have to end up triple tracking the entire railroad from Belen, New Mexico to California. That's where the traffic from Texas comes in. The other point I'd like to make is Keith Creel, I think, really did an interesting transaction when he acquired the Meridian and Bigsby Railroad from Genesee and Wyoming. That created the ability to have a direct interchange with the southeastern carriers, particularly CSX, to move intermodal traffic from Mexico into Atlanta and then up the coast.
Norm,
Yeah,
two things. That's one of the things I had in mind when I said Keith has done other things besides the merger. But that transaction has still not been signed off on by the STB.
that's correct, yeah. But it's a very, very interesting move, and G&W will retain the local switching rights under a trackage rights agreement. So all CP is looking to do is to move the manifest to a connection with CSX. The deal's a little bit more complicated, but that's the top level of it. Our next presentation meeting is going to be here in this room on October 29th. Paul Tutterlin.
No, that next one is the 10th.
I'm sorry, October 29th, right?
No, October 10th, Riley Edwards.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Riley Edwards is coming on October 10th. I didn't put it on my notes.
okay.
Riley is a part of the program at Illinois, the Railroad Engineering, Civil Engineering Program at Illinois. And also they have a library, or I'm sorry, a testing facility in Champaign that is one of the most interesting testing facilities. This is the U of I, University of Illinois. And Riley is a part of that program. He's the number 2 guy. Chris Parkin is the number 1 guy. And that program is very near and dear to our heart, being an alumni and also providing some financing to it through a fund, a not-for-profit fund. Then on October 29th, we're gonna have Paul, pronounce his last name for me, please.
I think it's Titterton, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's Titterton, yes.
Yeah.
Is that the proper pronunciation?
Yeah.
Paul is an executive vice president of GATX, the major leasing firm, and he is the president of the railroad division, railroad leasing operation. So we've asked him to give an overview of the leasing operation in the railroad industry, as well as some further thoughts. I would probably want to address him as Professor Paul when he's finished, as we had Professor Marty here today. Then our usual holiday meeting will be on December 16th with Tony,
Hatch.
Sorry,
Yeah, Tony Hatch, Metal Block. I was just reading one of his things again today. Tony is a man of few words. And I think we're gonna have a little bit of a different venue, but we'll make an announcement on that later. But in any event, we look forward to seeing you at these events, and then we'll start lining up the schedule for 2025. So again, thank you for coming. Thank you for staying with us. It was a very interesting meeting. Thanks, Marty.